Let's discuss it with our guest. Let us talk for more. Mr. Jason Smart, American political technologist and political scientist. What is the biggest threat to international stability these days, then, if we do, let me ask you a straightforward question?
Undoubtedly, it's the alliance between Russia and Iran. Between these two state actors, it's very obvious that they're sponsoring a number of non-state actors, such as Hamas, such as Hezbollah, which wreak havoc around the world. They also work with things like drug cartels in Latin America, and they're involved with other criminal enterprises in Asia. So this alliance is quite a dangerous one, and it presents a significant problem for not just the West, but the world entire.
So, the people like to tell me they're experts, first of all. Then they say that stability is good. But is stability good? Because, North Korea is stable, it is poor, it is a dictatorship. So any new thoughts after Biden's speech? Well, maybe the stability. What is stability? What kind of a stability do we need in a new world order? Let me ask you that way.
So there's different types of stability, but when we talk about North Korea being stable, it is relatively stable, but that's domestically. So that's not a problem for us. That's why there's very little interaction with North Korea. It's isolated and it's stable internally. Russia, before it invaded Ukraine, was obviously already a dictatorship. It was already non-democratic. It was already a kleptocracy. That being said, it was sort of left alone to do that. Nobody was really going to interfere with it because it was just, too much trouble. It's really their problem, not our problem. You only start to create instability once they start to create problems for other people. And in this case, this is why Russia is, the most sanctioned country in the history of the world, is specifically because it didn't just contain itself and remain internally stable with its dictatorship. Rather, it decided to try to export its fascism to other countries vis-a-vis the full-scale invasion of Ukraine.
Let me say that the world's democracy is under the threat of terror. Is Biden using, Biden is using that, actually, sentences like that. So is he using sort of a narrative as an element of his election campaign?
Yes. Most certainly democracy is something that Americans identify with. So as a campaign issue, that's something that does play well. Americans have historically had a sense that their country is unusually free and democratic, which is true if we compare it to the global scale. But at the same time, I think that he needs to do more to reach out to Americans to explain what it is in Ukraine. That's not simply about freedom and democracy, but it's directly the U.S.'s interest. Once Americans understand that this is something that's strategically wise for their own well-being and their security, not just a hypothetical, it's much more easy to identify with.
How to do that? How to convey the message? What the message should be to American nation? Not just like politicians and political scientists, and even maybe not media. How to talk to Americans? So to make them understand that human rights should be working all across the human universe. Otherwise, these are not rights. This is something else.
So I think that it's going to be multifold. One is that many people don't seem to realize that there's a direct correlation with the country being democratic, but also not being a threat to other countries. There's a reason that democratic countries have a tendency of not going to war, whereas authoritarian regimes do have a tendency of going to war. They don't have to worry about what their population thinks about it. Countries like the United States, it's perhaps and not a criticism that it's democratic, that's a good thing, but a criticism that they say, the Americans always worry about escalating the situation, escalating Moscow. And I think they do worry too much about that. But the reason is simple, is because, the president ultimately has to worry about his reelection, as he has to worry about his party's election in the Congress. And so they don't want to do anything that would escalate the situation, which would be unpopular with the domestic population. Whereas dictatorships just don't care. And that's why Putin is, completely unfazed by the fact that they're losing so many soldiers in Ukraine.
Yeah. Mike Johnson. What is for Ukraine to expect?
Well, Mike is quite clear on what he believes. What he has said publicly just in the past year is that he thought that there was a huge waste of money being sent to Ukraine. He thought it was a waste of time that Biden went to visit Kiev. He said that it was a poor use and that he's ignoring American needs to put the foreign needs instead in charge. He has also said there should be more investigations into where money has gone for Ukraine. And generally speaking, he's been quite negative about support for Ukraine. Out of the 7 laws that Congress has passed, or I should say budget amendments or other finance for Ukraine or weapons for Ukraine, out of the 7 that Congress has passed, he voted against 6 of them.
Let me return to the matter that interests me a lot. You said Russia and Iran are the axis of evil. What about China? Is China in the company?
So China's playing a different role. China recognizes that at this point it can't afford to do anything like that. Ideologically, it definitely likes to see what's going on. I mean, definitely does support this breaking down of the world order and the instability that comes with it. That being said, China, more than half of its imports and exports come from the United States and Europe. It's simply not its economic interest, where less than 2% of its economy is tied to Russia. It just financially, it's just impossible at this point to do something serious to ally with Russia or Iran. That being said, they are certainly looking at the situation of what is occurring with Ukraine, what is occurring in the Middle East, specifically for the U.S.'s reaction. And based upon that, if they think the U.S. is weak or the U.S. won't respond, then we have a different situation, which is China might very well try to take Taiwan.
Yeah, no response is a response, isn't it?
Exactly right. Exactly. So we have to be cautious of the fact that China is watching this, observing this carefully,
Right.
and is waiting to make its move as well.
Middle East, Israeli ground operation in Gaza Strip. Could that ignite a global fire?
Most certainly. I mean, we are at the verge of some very complicated things. We know that Iranian-backed militants have been engaged in a number of different attacks in Yemen, obviously within Palestine itself against Israel. We see it from Lebanon as well. We see it throughout the region. I mean, Iran is definitely stepping up the degree that's engaging in international terrorism in multiple countries in the Middle East. But it's not just limited there. It's important to note that Iran has for years been trading with things like drug cartels in Latin America. A huge amount of gold shipped from Venezuela, for instance, to Iran, which is some of the ways that they get money despite the sanctions. But then they use this money to specifically finance terrorist organizations. So all in all, when we look at this, we can be quite certain that Iran is posing a significant threat to the world, and that's why if tomorrow, Israel launches its ground attack on Gaza, and it's able to rally support within the Arab world or the Muslim world as a whole, I should say, then there is a chance of this becoming much more complicated.
One more little thing. Netanyahu, Prime Minister of Israel, calls Putin. What is this?
So it's a good question. Now, there's a very complicated issue they have with Russia, which is often talked about, namely the situation in Syria as being actually one of those major issues. Russia obviously exerts direct influence over the Assad regime in Syria. And so the only ability to negotiate with Assad's regime is via the Russians. So that's quite important for Israel. Second to that is the situation within Iran itself. The eternal partner of Iran is Russia. And so this allows them to deal with the Russians who are, to be fair, compared to the Iranians, more rational. Russia does not have a state policy of trying to eliminate Israel, whereas the Iranians do have that as a state policy. So if they're trying to get the Iranians to not, start launching ballistic missile attacks on Israel, it's definitely not the Americans that can help with that, because the fact is we don't have diplomatic relations with Iran. We have no ability to influence that. Whereas we can only influence it by offering to, use force against Iran should that happen.
Right, yeah.
Whereas the Russians do actually speak to them. So it's a really difficult situation, because I would be the last person in the world to ever say speaking to Russia is going to be a good idea. In the case of Israel, they don't have a lot of other options, given the fact that their neighbors are terrorists. And not many people are willing to deal with terrorists, but the Russians are happy to.
Okay, well, Ukraine, look at the world, Ukraine, Israel, Nagorno-Karabakh, Azerbaijan and Armenia. Is there any way to cease the fire right now to prevent the global mayhem?
So at this point, it's going to be very complicated. And I think really the most important question that lays at hand here is what happens in Gaza. If the Gaza invasion begins and it does cause a lot of civilian casualties, like we remember when there was just last week the attack on the hospital, which seems that it was a Hamas weapon that exploded, but it was initially blamed on Israel. Within hours, there was tens and tens of thousands of people rallying and rioting in various Muslim capitals, which is probably indicative of the fact that tensions are high already. If something else were to trigger another reaction like this, it would give those governments let's say the moral obligation is how they would define it, but it's all fake. I mean, they would just use this justification to need to then start attacking Israel as well. But it's just a justification. The fact is that these countries hate Israel and they wish to destroy it. But neither here nor there. I think if we look at what's going on in Azerbaijan and Armenia, if we look at what's going on in Kosovo and Serbia, if we look at all these different situations, this is undoubtedly the hand of Russia. Russia's the one that has the most to gain from this. And all the analysis that's come out in the United States so far about who has gained from Hamas's October 7th attack on Israel all analysis, especially those who are not not Russia experts, but rather Middle Eastern experts, say that Russia is the clear beneficiary, the biggest winner of those attacks.
Thank you very much, Mr. Smart. It was a pleasure again. Hope to talk to you soon.